this is an appropriate place to talk about Harry Edwards. From what I know, he was probably the greatest of the English spiritual healers. An incredible man. I never met him, but I've been to the sanctuary, what he called the sanctuary, which still exists in Guildford, in England, where he practiced for many years. And he got incredible results. Not always, but very often. And I've heard so many stories how people would come to him crippled and leave in perfect condition. One of the healers there now told me when he was a boy, he lived there. He said there used to be a whole room where people had left behind their crutches and wheelchairs and so forth. An extraordinary man. He wrote some extraordinary books, which are themselves, just to read them is very high energy. And there are tapes that he has made, which are also very high energy. So healing was obviously his major cantillatory activity, although I'm sure, so he was in a state of cantillation most, if not all, of his life. Extraordinary, extraordinary man. Extraordinary man. One of my most memorable experiences was once being on an overnight or just an all-day ferry going from Halifax, Nova Scotia, down to Bar Harbour in Maine. And I had like a little cabin, and it was very, very rough, very rough. And when I had a meal, I was the only person in this large dining room. And I would lie in my cabin. I was reading one of Harry Edwards' books. And the engine is throbbing, which is like this deep pulsation of life. And then the boat is rocking and moving with this incredible power of the ocean. It was a wonderful feeling, wonderful feeling. And Harry Edwards coming, as it were, straight to me through the pages. And I've always sort of, only I could write with whatever it was that Harry Edwards passed on to me in his writing. Extraordinary, extraordinary man. And somewhere he writes, and he talks about the spiritualization of life. And trying to bring a little bit of Freud into it, I call this the spirit, because Freud wrote a book called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. So I call this the spiritualization of everyday life. And that should be how we go through life every day. And that's what I mean by a life of cantillation. Not just when you're singing, not just when you're taking the photographs, but using that high spiritual experience and generalizing it into everything throughout the day, through everything. The spiritualization of everyday life. And therefore to recognize there is, shall we say, what the American Indians called, in our language, the Great Spirit. To recognize that we all are spirit, that everyone is spirit, that everyone in his or her own way and its own way is the Great Spirit. And then to live our lives accordingly. So another way of talking about cantillation, life as a song of love for the love, is to say the spiritualization of our everyday lives, of everything we do. Recognizing that there is this Great Spirit and that everything we do, as I'm led to believe, is guided by our spirit guides. As it were, directed, if that is the word, by what is called the Great Spirit. And as I've said before, and then all that we do, all that is done to us and through us, is basically for the evolution of the Spirit within us. Everything is by the Spirit, for the Spirit. And that's what I mean by the spiritualization of everyday life. And I think about this frequently. And whenever I do, I give thanks to Harry Edwards.